so much for coming. I want to thank some folks who are here. First of all, we've got everyone who came out tonight. Hopefully you all can spend some time meeting our panelists afterwards. So we'll do from 5:45 to about 7. We'll be having discussion. And then afterwards we'll have a little reception. We'll move the room around a little bit. And you all are welcome to meet the panelists, get their autographs, take photographs with them, ask them to come visit you in their homes. And let me just do a couple housekeeping items. Hopefully everyone's okay with the temperature. We're keeping it a little cool because it will get warmer as more folks show up. The bathrooms are in the back. There's one on the left. Don't lock the door if you are walking out because then the bathroom will be locked. There is also restrooms around the corner out the back door, and the code is 3421 if you need those restrooms. Let's see, other logistics. You've got cards on your chairs. If you have any questions, please feel free to fill out the card. We hopefully will have time. We got a few questions pre-submitted, and we'll start with those, but if you have questions, you're welcome to submit them if we have time. I want to introduce my awesome colleagues who are here tonight, who are helping with our event. First of all, we've got our Community Engagement Director, who's opening the door. This is Jade Moreno-Chua. Hey, Jade. We've got our outgoing Manager of Development Projects, Jake Wild. And Jake is outgoing because he is going to be focusing on his Master's in Urban Planning at San Jose State as a grad student. And we've been very lucky to work with him for 20 long months. And we've also got our Technical Program Manager, Shalini Gupta. Thank you, Shalini. She's our long-standing employee. How long now, Shalini? 3 years, wow. 2, yeah. And Shalini is Executive Director of another organization called New Vista that does work in the senior community that's really great here. So we're excited that she's here. And so I want to talk a little bit about why we're doing this event and the genesis of it. And then I'm going to have the panelists say hello. We're also not long on fancy introductions. So if you want to read their bios, I recommend going to the websites that we linked in the event and you can read all about them. We also want to thank our sponsors, Housing Choices and Meriwest Credit Union, for supporting today's event. With sponsorships, we also want to thank South Bay YIMBY and Livable Sunnyvale for helping promote the event. So thank you to the folks who have been supporting us. So I want to share a little bit about why we're doing this event. Well, Catalyze SV was started about 7 years ago, maybe more, to try to address some of the community opposition to housing in Silicon Valley. And as you probably all know, it has continued. It hasn't necessarily stopped. Sometimes it might feel like it's grown, but it's definitely still a part of our community. And we, meanwhile, know that there are some experts out in this country who know about this subject. For, I think, about 7 or 8 years ago, I first read research in the New York Times from Clayton Nall, and was really excited that he was at Stanford at the time and started interacting with him. Meanwhile, on KQED, a while back, Jessica Trounstine was on that show, and I realized that she was at my alma mater, Vanderbilt University, and then I figured out she's a San Jose native, and so Jessica was someone we wanted to bring back to her hometown to talk about her wisdom. And finally, Katherine, who has a book we'll be talking about called Neighborhood Defenders that has been also influential in Catalyze SV's work, talking about the disproportionality of folks who show up in the community engagement process when it comes to development and these conversations. And so all of their research has been really important and impactful for our organization. And we are so, I can't swear, but so freaking lucky that these three came from far away, from Santa Barbara, from Nashville, and from Boston University to be here with us today. And on top of that, they did it out of the goodness of their own heart. They're dedicating their time and their immense wisdom to all of us. So we are so fortunate. This event has been, Katherine and I have been talking about it for about 2 years, trying to get her out from Boston. So We are so grateful that you all are here. Thank you. And we have a voice that you probably know. How many folks listen to KQED here? Woo! And how many folks know the housing reporting that goes on at KQED? Well, we're very lucky that Adhiti is here from KQED, and she covers housing. And there's a lot about the subject, and it will help me co-moderate tonight. So we are going to intersperse your questions with the questions from Adhiti and myself, and let's go ahead and get started. Any other housekeeping items I'm missing?
You can introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Alex Shoor. I'm one of the co-founders of Catalyze and our executive director. And you are in the co-working space that we share with the nonprofit Spur and San Jose State's real estate and urban planning program. It calls this Studio on the Street. And it's fun to be here. We're very lucky to have one of the folks who brought us into this space, Kelly Snyder here, who's at San Jose State. And I see you just poked into the room, the new council member-elect who represents the area, Adhiti, who is a very, very staunch urbanist, housing advocate, and we're lucky he's joining us for a little bit too. So let's go ahead and get started with some questions. Adhiti, are you kicking it off?
I think you're kicking it off.
Okay, great. Well, our first question is pretty simple. It is, why, to our panelists, is there so much community opposition to housing? I think we want to start with the overview question, and Adhiti, if I missed anything.
There are a lot of reasons, right, that people don't like housing. To start with, sort of a couple of the big explanations that scholars propose for this, right? One is that people just don't like change, right? People don't like to see new things happen in their neighborhood. New development inherently means your views getting changed. It might mean sort of disruptions to your parking, to traffic, right? There are all sorts of rapid changes that might happen in your community as a consequence of new development that might make you not like it, right? You might also perceive it as a threat to your property values. You might think that this is something that is going to threaten the value of your home. And finally, we might think about sort of the people you might worry about moving into that housing. It might be based in race-based or class-based fears.
I mean, that's an excellent overview. I just want to sort of add that it's not new. Humans have, from the beginning, as soon as cities have started to densify, people decided that they didn't want to live near other people. And so, there's community opposition to housing goes back literally hundreds of years in the United States.
I think, so I'm curious, to go off of that, do you think that, and this is to the group, do you think that it's gotten worse over time? Like, how has it changed?
Well, has community opposition gotten worse, or the actual effects of the community opposition?
I think both, actually, yeah.
So, yes, there has been opposition to housing in the past. It's been formalized a lot more since Bill Fischel says the 1970s. There's this period of significant inflation, housing inflation. People began to treat their homes as investment properties versus just a place where they lived and obtained consumption value from. Instead, they see their house as their nest egg. Now, it's not only homeowners who are opposed to new development, new construction. Depending on which survey you look at, I've run surveys that show that homeowners are more opposed to new development. I've more recently run surveys which suggest actually, everybody's just opposed to significant changes to their neighborhood. There's a small margin there, but it's not nearly as huge as you'd expect. So really, since the 1970s, where we've seen a big boom in regulation, environmental protections, much more formal zoning. I don't know if Jessica,
I think that's exactly right. That the opposition, it may look or feel worse because we are more dense than we used to. We have more people who live in cities than we used to, right? And so the problems of conflict become more challenging. But what really changed, as Clayton said, in the 1970s was the regulatory structure around housing and development. And so there's more conflict in the policy arena than there used to be, right? It used to be much easier to build housing, and it, starting in the 70s, stopped being so easy to build housing. And Bill Fischel is right. There's this moment at which housing starts to become an investment for people in a way that it didn't before. Fischel is an economist, and so this is not. He has an economic reason for it. But there's something else that happened in the late 1960s, which was the civil rights movement. And the integration of housing changed a lot of neighborhoods it threatened to change in people's minds, white homeowners' minds in a very big way. And so it's the combination of economics and race that really spurred the policy changes in the 1970s.
So I just want to emphasize like how important that change in the regulatory structure is, right? Because public opposition is so consequential today to housing development, in part because our regulatory structure allows public opposition to sort of be a central part of the housing development process. That regulatory structure is what creates the endless public hearings, which can delay projects by years and years and years. And so you can have lots of public opposition, but in the absence of that type of regulatory structure, it might have an impact in terms of lawsuits or elections, but it's not going to have this sort of powerful impact that it's having in places like the Bay Area by creating that sort of endless development process.
Is it follow-up or should I jump in?
Yeah.
Okay. And when you see Adhiti and I looking at our phones, we are not texting people. We are looking at our notes and the questions we prepped. So yeah, we're new school. So I think we already started to talk a little bit about the fear of change. Let's delve a little deeper, if we can, into the psychology of the opposition. Because you talked a moment ago about the regulatory framework, but there's also psychology involved. So any insights anyone has on what you know about the psychology of community opposition?
Clayton has an amazing new paper on it, so
Yeah.
I think you should start.
Talk about your paper.
Right, so we have my colleague Chris Ellendorf, who has actually appeared pretty prominently in a lot of housing debates here in California, is probably the leading academic working on CEQA reform in the state legislature, and has done a lot of work on housing politics as well. He and I have been co-authoring, along with Stan Klokjia from UC Riverside. We've been working on a paper looking at why people don't support the idea of just building more housing to solve the housing crisis and housing shortage. You'd think this would be fairly straightforward. And what a lot of previous work has said, well, people are homeowners. They are concerned about protecting their property values, and that's why they oppose building more housing. Doesn't really explain why a lot of renters, depending on which survey you're looking at, could be like 40 to 60%, don't support building housing either. So they're the ones who would benefit from having more housing built. So why are they opposed? What we find is people don't actually believe that markets work the same way for housing as they do for other types of goods. So if I asked you, if we had a supply shortage of new cars, which many of us have probably experienced, what does that do to the price of used cars on the market? They go up, right? Well, you can think about houses the same way. You have a supply of new cars, and you have a stock of existing used cars, or new houses and used houses. What happens when you don't build more new houses? The used houses increase in value. That logic seems to make a lot of sense, but when we ask people questions on surveys, they get the car question right. They get questions about supply and demand and labor markets right, and answer them repeatedly correct across multiple surveys. When it comes to housing, not only do they get the questions wrong, but they don't seem to have a firmly held view. So they really haven't thought a whole lot systemically about housing markets. Instead, they tend to personalize, and there's this idea called folk economics. Just the idea that everyday people, when they're thinking about how economic transactions work, how do they think? Well, you hear this say from tenant rights advocates. The problem the reason for high rental prices is the landlords are greedy, right? Not that the landlords are exploiting the shortage in the market. And so it's much easier to focus on the people who are to blame for, say, undercutting you economically than to focus on the larger market-wide problems that are caused in large part by regulation.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is that unlike other goods, housing is like a very personal thing, and when we think about it, we attach a lot of personal sentiments to it. Is that right? And that kind of warps the way we think about it as a commodity?
I think that's something that's consistent with our findings. There may be a number of other factors that explain why people are responding the way they do to, or don't understand how, or don't seem not to understand or think about how housing markets work. One reason is that, say, like unlike the price of eggs, with the price of eggs, you go to the store once a week, you see how they go up and down, you see how that's consistent with news stories. When do people see the price of housing go down? During a recession, right, or during a crash. And unless, except for some very rare exceptions. For example, in Austin, which is a boom town, apartment prices are going down because they're building and building and building. So in those cases, there are a few really rare cases like that. Largely, people don't see the price of housing go down. And if you ask them to think counterfactually, and the question that we asked was, if we built a lot more housing, like 10% more housing, or basically we said a lot more housing than we built right now, what would that do to price in 5 years? Would they be higher or lower than they would be otherwise, which is the important question. Then they would be otherwise. People have a very hard time dealing with that kind of counterfactual reasoning, even though that is the most important policy question. Can we make housing cheaper than it would be otherwise?
Right, so instead of housing prices going up as rapidly as they otherwise would go up, building new housing makes the rise slower. And that's a very hard concept for people to understand.
You mentioned Austin, and I'm curious to talk to both of y'all because you come from other states. What does community opposition look like in Tennessee, in Massachusetts?
Go ahead. I think Massachusetts is incredibly similar to here. It's an incredibly high cost market. People bring up, I think, a lot of the same types of considerations. One's about the environment, about traffic, about new housing making things more expensive, right? Like I think all of those arguments really come to bear, and it is a similarly very zoned area, right? Like the zoning regulations are incredibly stringent, and so as a consequence, I think the dynamics are pretty similar.
Yeah, they're different in Tennessee. And it's different in Tennessee, not because people are less opposed to new housing, but because the regulatory structure is much weaker. So the regulatory structure favors development and developers in Tennessee, which might not be surprising to you. And in Nashville, it's possible, it's this new thing in California that you can do lot splits and build quadplexes. That's always been true in Nashville, and so the whole city has quadplexes and lot splits all over the place. The way that Nashville governs housing, the most restrictive thing that Nashville does is through historical preservation districts. And so that's the mechanism that Nashville uses. And I would submit that every city that I have ever looked at in the entire United States has something that they use. They use some mechanism to protect neighborhoods of powerful, active members of the community. But it's different in different places.
Wow, thanks for sharing. That's super interesting. Hopefully we'll hear some more examples. Remember, we've got note cards if you have questions. Teresa will help collect those. And let's go to a question that we got submitted ahead of time from Jennifer. Jennifer wants to know from these three wise folks, what strategies do you suggest for shifting community and political perceptions that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are not capable of living independently, or that supportive housing is a quote-unquote handout? As an advocate, I've encountered attitudinal ableism, ranging from fear of having people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as neighbors to disbelief in their actual autonomy. How do we counter those views and grow support for inclusive, accessible, low-income housing, presumably for people with disabilities?
So I think there's a lot of research which suggests that there's in general more opposition to affordable housing than there is to housing in general, which is not market rate housing obviously also gets a lot of opposition, but I think there is particularly strong opposition in some places to affordable housing. There is strong opposition in some places. I think there's a lot of research suggesting that there's a lot of opposition to housing for homeless people and homeless shelters and this kind of thing, right? And I think building support is actually incredibly difficult, right? And to some degree, and I'm sure you guys have examples of this too, when these entities tend to get built, it is more often than not because the state government steps in some way and overrides the local government's ability to oppose housing. And so just as one example, in Massachusetts, since the 1970s, we've had a law on the books called Chapter 40B, which allows housing developments that have at least 25% affordable units to essentially override local zoning in places that don't have like a lot of affordable housing, right?
In California, we call it the builder's remedy. It's like the same thing.
Yeah. So in Massachusetts, we've had it right for 5 decades now, and that has been by far the #1 producer of supportive housing and subsidized housing since its inception. The federal government has really stepped back from supporting this type of housing, and so fundamentally, I think getting that type of housing built has required state government remedies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question is broader than just disabilities, right? So there's community opposition to most kinds of supportive housing, as Katie is saying, but there is opposition to any kinds of denser housing, right? And so part of this is about about the density, right? So where I lived, I used to live in Merced, California. That's where I spent the last 15 years of my career before I went to Vanderbilt. In Merced, California, there was constant opposition to elder housing, right? Because it was denser, right? And so this very sprawling, sort of agriculturally oriented community is used to these huge properties, and to build 6 units on a single property to support elder housing was unconscionable in some neighborhoods. So I do think it's broader than the disabilities question.
If I could pick up on something that Katherine, Katie, I know it's Katie, sorry. She and I were in grad school together. So I think she makes a really important point, which is that I think we would like to think that public policy is going to be responsive to public preferences or public opinion, but we don't really make policy by plebiscite. One of the things that we've converged on, my co-authors and I have converged on, Chris Elmendorf and I, is that a lot of things that have been done in California have been things that have been really in the inside game of the state legislature, where there's been just the right movements by very effective legislators, particularly Scott Wiener and Buffy Wicks on NIMBY bills, and they have they push these things through without necessarily polling the public. And it so happens that as YIMBY has had more success, the public opinion has shifted with that success. So when it comes to creating supportive housing, if the state mandates it, that creates a new status quo. That really changes how local opponents are going to respond.
I'm gonna switch up some of the order of the questions, but speaking of public perception, I mean, I think right now in this year 2025, we're in this really interesting moment because I think historically legislation has kind of added more regulations, and we're in this state right now, especially in California, where a lot of streamlining is happening. I'm curious to get y'all's perspective on what does that say about how people feel about the housing affordability crisis, but first let's ask that question. I have a follow-up.
I mean, there has been change. California is a leader, but there are other states too that are making, big changes. And I think that the very short answer to your question is it got bad enough. It got bad enough that people saw that their parents couldn't live near them, or that their kids couldn't live near them, or that they couldn't afford, to live in a community. And, we talk about this a lot as academics, but the voices that most need to be heard oftentimes in a community are not at the table because they're not in the community, right? That's the whole point. They've been zoned out of the community. And so the debate has to move to the state level in order to bring those voices to the table. And it has in some places, and Massachusetts is another, right? But there states are starting to move in this direction. And I do think, as Clayton said, that there has been movement in public opinion.
Yeah, there has been, but there's also, everyone has probably heard the everything bagel problem, which is that, Ezra Klein's big idea that even as California has been deregulating, every one of these bills is having little riders put in that address some sort of special interest group or interest group or equity organization preference. which often ends up imposing additional regulation on housing. Things like right of return to housing. So like existing tenants have to have a right to go back to housing if you're gonna like tear down or rebuild an apartment. These things all add costs to the development process. And if you have just the monomaniacal goal of building more housing, these are things that you would strip out of bills entirely. It's something that really has to be done to, I think, to satisfy the Democratic Party coalition, and the various groups within the Democratic Party that are demanding these provisions. They're not all productive for actually building housing.
Right. I mean, I think it remains to be seen whether or not these changes at the state level are going to actually result in a tremendous amount of new housing. I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, SB 9 has not produced that much housing. It
It
hasn't been invoked.
didn't in Minneapolis either, right? They built like 30 new duplexes or something.
Yeah.
And not to put too fine a point on it, but just instead of basically eliminating the laws and taking them off the books, is creating new laws saying, if you do X and Y and Z and A and B, then you can build the housing you want.
Right.
So it is a very different approach than saying, hey, that regulation doesn't work at all, let's just remove it.
Well, and I think I'm curious too, as a follow-up, like, as, so we covered the legislature at KQED, we covered what bills are going through, what is kind of being introduced, and in the same year that we had a bill that really, two bills that streamlined the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, which, was long, I guess, heralded and also, I guess, like criticized for holding up housing development. In the same year, there's another bill that's making its way through the legislature that is in response to the the wildfires in LA that happened earlier this year. And the bill basically states, it's written by Wahab. And basically what it states is that if you're living in a rent-controlled apartment and your apartment burns down or gets swept up in a flood or some sort of natural disaster, the landlord has to rebuild it and offer it again at a rent-controlled rate. Now, the housing activists say that's going to be horrible for developers. It's not going to pencil out. The landlord is going to decide not to build again because they're not going to be able to do it. At the same time, renters groups are like, yeah, but we were displaced from the fires. Like, we can't afford market rate rents. How do you see this point where we are now with trying to kind of build more housing and streamline things, and yet the crisis is still so real that I think, there is still this push and pull. Like, how do you grapple with that?
I mean, so there's a couple of questions embedded in your
That's a loaded question.
in your question there. But most laws that are passed that have created problems in the housing space had good intent. CEQA had good intent. The laws about public participation had good intent. And so this is the policy process, right? Is that there are trade-offs when you make these kinds of when you make these kinds of decisions. To me, the only way to deal with the immediacy of need in the housing space is to give people money to rent housing, right? I mean, so there's that if you don't have enough money to rent housing or housing is too expensive, we have to fix that problem while we're building housing.
Do we want to take questions from the audience interspersed or?
Just, yeah, we can hand them to Adhiti or myself, yeah. We've kind of already talked a little bit, Adhiti, about you two live in a different state and how things are different. Clayton has lived in the Bay Area and now is in Santa Barbara. Anything else you all want to add about the differences between California's community opposition and housing landscape versus other places, or within the state of California, Bay Area versus SoCal?
I think one of the other really interesting differences is actually the dynamics of getting state policy passed, right? We have huge variation nationally in sort of what our state legislatures look look like. Some are really highly professionalized, right? So that's sort of the California example. And in other places, New Hampshire is always my favorite prototypical example of this. It's like borderline a volunteer organization, right? With a huge legislative body. And so I think there's really interesting and important and different dynamics when you're dealing with those types of state legislatures. So what you guys have been hearing a lot about the California process is that I think there's a lot of interest group involvement in state politics, right? And so we have both groups on the left and the right who I think are adding lots of things to these policies and potentially sometimes making them less effective or introducing sort of challenging trade-offs. And so I think that's another space, when you're trying to understand the housing politics process, sort of differences in what state politics look like, I think really matter.
I think one of the other really important and interesting differences in the housing space is what the history of segregation is in the community and the degree to which housing politics threaten to disrupt what people believe to be, the way it's always been.
That's a perfect segue to you talk about your comic book. Do you want to talk about that? It's fantastic.
I brought a prop. It's ridiculous. So this is free on my website. It's a comic version of my academic book, and I'll leave it up here for people to look at it later. But yeah, so it's a graphic novel. I'm supposed to call it. It's more serious than a comic. But it basically tells the story of a couple that is looking for housing, and they have this list of demands. They want the house to be inexpensive, and they want it to have a certain number of bedrooms, and they want it to be charming and near to where the spouse is gonna work. And so it seems like a reasonable list of demands, but then they go shopping for houses, and every neighborhood that they find has a problem. And the sort of moral of the story is that the problems are not with the houses, it's with the neighborhood and the community around the neighborhood or what has happened in that neighborhood. And so the comic tells the story of the history behind how we got to this place, where some neighborhoods are filled with cute, charming homes and people who make lots of money, and other neighborhoods are not filled with those kinds of things. And the history is what I write about in my book, which is the history of the regulatory process that we were talking about before. So it's, again, it's free on my website. Download it. send it out to everyone, but yeah.
Heidi, can we ask the elected official question?
Yeah, of course. Well, I guess it's really interesting, actually. I have my own questions about this. So the question is, why is it that, this leads into a bigger discussion, but why is it that when we often see elected officials talking about housing or trying to address the problem, they will kind of say one thing and do another thing? So for example, I live in San Francisco, and we often talk about vacancy rates, because vacancy, there are some percentage of homes that are vacant. So the supervisors passed a vacancy tax. The vacancy tax, for what it's worth, has not actually been implemented yet, but I recently did a story which showed that the vacancy tax, even if it was implemented, it might free up a few homes, but not enough to actually solve the problem. So it's like a way of saying you're doing something when really not so much. Why do we get into that, and how do we spot that as constituents or citizens that are voting?
So politicians want to be reelected, right? And so that's sort of fundamentally what motivates a lot of sort of their behavior. And so sort of what you're describing is a classic example of sort of symbolic politics, right? They're saying sort of something that seems like it's addressing this big policy issue, while in practice it isn't going to, one, solve the issue, but it's also not going to offend anyone either, right? That's the key, right? You're going to make, no one's going to be super upset by this policy decision. You're sort of symbolically taking a step in the right direction. And so that makes it really electorally appealing. And the reason this is so, why they do this, right? Why don't they want to meaningfully address the housing crisis? Any streamlining policy they pass will take years to have an impact on housing prices. and likely the impact will be marginal. And going back to Clayton's earlier point about counterfactuals, there is no elected official who wants to run on the platform that housing would have been more expensive had I not passed this zoning reform, right? Like, yes, prices went up, but think about how much worse it would have been if I hadn't done this sort of very complicated regulatory reform. It's much more politically attractive to say something about, look at what I did about this vacancy tax. That's something that everyone can wrap their head around, even if it's not going to have a meaningful impact on the housing crisis.
I would also submit that there's a very large percentage of the public that does not want to build more housing. And so there's a lot of elected officials who want to get reelected and not force communities to build new housing.
What is like the misconception that like keeps you up at night? Like the thing that you're like, man, if only people understood that this is like not quite what they think it is.
Yeah, I would say the number one thing is that landlords don't set prices. Like unless they have a monopoly over a local market, which is extremely rare, especially for smaller scale multifamily residential. It's an extremely fragmented market. So no landlord has pricing power in these markets. The landlords are responding to what the market will bear. They take prices, they don't make prices. This is something that I think a lot of people, when they talk about why is housing so expensive, why is the rent so damn high, we asked them this question on a survey, like, who is most to blame for the price of housing being high in your community? Anyone want to take a guess, say, who's the number one culprit? Landlords. Yeah, landlords, right. But then developers, the people who actually build the housing that would increase supply, are right behind. If you actually talk to economists, most political scientists who are not very far to the left, they would say homeowners are responsible because they're the ones who bolster these regulatory regimes. But homeowners are among the least blamed groups in our survey. Environmental groups or anti-development activists also barely blamed at all by the public. So I think this is the idea that there is a cabal of people who are buying up housing and people say BlackRock, but it's not BlackRock, it's Blackstone, regardless. Like the fact that you have both J.D. Vance and Ro Khanna toning this line that corporate buyers are explain why housing prices are going up in the single family market it's maddening, but it also speaks to the messages that resonate with voters. And it's easy to identify a villain and polarize public opinion around that villain.
Keeps you up at night.
I think I would say getting public officials to believe that building more housing will reduce prices. So we've done research which shows that somewhere around 40 to 50% of mayors of cities over 75,000 do not believe that building more market rate housing will reduce prices. And these are people who are they are following housing debates, right? These are supposed to be people who are pretty informed about housing policy, housing economics. And so if a population like that sort of doesn't believe in this fundamental laws of supply and demand, if they're supply skeptics, right, to use sort of some of Clayton's research, that's really concerning. I think the other area where that sort of housing skepticism is really concerning to me is actually the area of homelessness. So 60% of mayors don't see housing as sort of the primary cause of homelessness, right? They don't sort of see that as like the root cause. And to me, that it's sort of a problem, right? If the people, again, who are sort of supposed to be the most informed on these issues are not sort of seeing the housing supply as fundamentally connected to these really important issues like housing affordability and homelessness.
I guess the one piece of information that I like to convey to people is that segregation is purposeful. Regulations surrounding housing were invented in order to produce and protect segregation, and they continue to produce and protect segregation today.
Do you mean racial segregation, socioeconomic?
All kinds. Yes, so the first, I could go on forever about this. I'll be brief. Mostly racial and socioeconomic, right? So renters have been maligned from very early on. Lower socioeconomic status homeowners have been maligned. and Black neighbors were maligned, but also ethnic differences. So the very first zoning law was in part, there's a couple of different pieces of this, but passed in order to prevent immigrants from Eastern Europe from living near Fifth Avenue. They were working in the factories.
I was going to jump in on Katherine's book. So Katherine has a book called Neighborhood Defenders. And it sounds good, maybe it is, maybe it's not, but I think we should talk about unpacking. What is, Katherine, a neighborhood defender? And what do we not understand, or what would surprise us about that?
Yeah, so our book was broadly about sort of the people who show up to public hearings to oppose housing. And we really wanted to understand sort of who those folks are, what motivated them. And so one of the things that one of the first things we had to do, right, writing a book like this, is figure out, like, what are we going to call these people? Because traditionally, right, I think a lot of academic work has referred to them as NIMBYs, sort of people who have not in my backyard attitudes. And that's sort of inherently a selfish and sort of pejorative term, right? I think very few people self-identify as a NIMBY, right? That there's no way they're standing around saying, like, I am opposing housing because I want to preserve my property values, right? Like, I think that could very well be their motivation, but I think very few people sort of come out and say that. So the reason we came to the term neighborhood defender, which is actually a term that was used a lot in school desegregation debates, is that it's a term that fundamentally captures people who want to protect and preserve their community as it is. Right, and so that could be about preserving sort of some sort of environmental characteristic that really matters to them. It could also be about preserving exclusive access to public goods and keeping sort of people from different racial and socioeconomic backgrounds from accessing their communities, right? So being a defender of your neighborhood can encompass a wide variety of different attributes, but we thought that this sort of better captures why these folks sort of, how they perceive themselves, but also why they're so effective. Right, because the average politician is not going to be persuaded by someone whose arguments seem fundamentally narrow-minded and selfish, right? But it's a lot easier to think about these sort of arguments as being persuasive if they're sort of community-minded. It's like, no, these people are trying to protect their neighborhoods. That sort of sounds inherently good, right? And explains why they have such a policy impact.
It's interesting because Catalyze SB and other pro-housing organizations will go and advocate, our members and our staff, for housing across the valley. And every neighborhood we go to, people will say, oh, I want housing, but not here in this neighborhood. So, and yet you never see those folks go, well, I oppose the housing in my neighborhood, but I'm here today to support the housing in yours. So they will only defend their neighborhood. They have very little vested interest in other neighborhoods. So I think that term really rings true in that sense. Some of the research that Catalyze SV cites, I think is yours, Katherine, is that the folks who show up at community engagement are disproportionately whiter, wealthier, older, single-family homeowners. And so those are the folks that are generally dictating and dominating some of our public discussion when it comes to development and housing.
I want to go back to this idea when we were talking about, housing myths and ideas that people have about housing. There's a question from the audience that I think really is interesting. So you were talking, Katherine, about the fact that there are elected officials who don't believe that building more housing will eventually yield lower cost of housing. And someone from the audience was asking, okay, so if you build all the housing, is there like some sort of like limit? Like when do we know that we've built enough? And I think like to further that question, if housing is always going to be a commodity, then like doesn't that ensure that there will always be scarcity?
So I think Clayton brought up Austin earlier. I think Austin, Texas is a great example of sort of the principle that if we build more housing in places that are sort of rapid growth, places that have had lots of job growth, we can actually reduce housing prices. And so I guess my answer to that question about when do we know when we've built enough is when prices start to stabilize or start to even come down, right? And to be clear, I don't think these types of sort of supply-oriented solutions alone are going to help people who are really struggling to afford housing. You know, Jessica raised the importance of giving people money and providing housing subsidies. I think that's really important in conjunction with building more housing to really sort of address the full spectrum of needs in the housing market.
Really good point.
I would, to add to that, I do think that there's a risk, and there's a paper that just came out this week and talking about, say, demand side subsidies, which is that, of course, Section 8 vouchers are a very direct and effective way of helping people to afford housing. But if we scale them up enough and we don't increase the supply of housing,
Right.
if we actually scale them up as much as housing advocates, I think, understand we need to scale them up to make them available and not just have long queues for Section 8 vouchers,
Right.
then we're just going to see more inflation in rental markets. And I think this is a problem that challenges a lot of these demand side solutions, which are incredibly politically popular. The idea, one of the most popular policies that people support is first mortgage down payment assistance. Like, let's just give people cash for the first down payment, which it will almost certainly just translate into higher prices on sale.
If you're not building lots of new houses.
Yeah, if you're not, that's exactly right.
Because they'll pass on that cost, is that what?
Because you're
Yeah.
increasing demand.
Here it's increasing demand, but so the answer, I would answer a slight modification to Katie's answer to your question, which is we've seen places where the answer to that question has been provided, which is at the point where it's no longer profitable for builders to build and make money on the building, then there's been enough housing built. And there are actually a bunch of markets in the United States where this is true. Homelessness, it's extremely low in Detroit and Milwaukee. The housing is also really terrible, and there's been very little new housing built in Detroit or other markets where there's just a glut of old, often vacant housing. So these aren't places that one would necessarily want to live, but there are also very few people living on the street in these cities as a result of that glut of housing.
There's a lot of work out there that shows a very strong correlation between the number of units that get built and the number of the lack of homelessness, right? So, and the cost of housing, right? This is not a debate, right? That if you build more housing, prices will rise more slowly. And there's just lots of evidence of that. And in the United States, for a very long time, the building market really followed the cost of housing. And so if you're a developer and you see the cost of housing increasing in some neighborhood, the smart thing to do is go build a bunch of housing in that neighborhood because you're going to make money there. What happened, we saw the rise of, old Victorians being cut into flats, or single family units being transformed into multifamily units. That's how the housing market in the United States worked for a very long time, but it changed in the 1970s. And that is because of the regulatory changes that have happened.
Got a question from Mike, who submitted ahead of time. A few parts to this question, but with some context. Given that homeowners, A, have paid enormous sums for their homes, B, read about California's population decline, C, deal with traffic congestion, and D, read about ever fewer restrictions on housing sizes, units, height, setbacks, how can cities and counties in the state, for that matter, do a better and more proactive job of selling to their communities the idea that there is a tremendous need for more below market rate housing and even market rate housing? Or do you believe cities and government agencies are doing a good job of this?
So I think one example, there's actually, so Massachusetts, like California, has passed sort of a lot of laws recently trying to streamline the regulatory process. And one, which I think is quite similar to one you guys have in California, basically required communities served by mass transit to allow a lot more housing density. And some communities did exactly as I know many in California have done, and basically defied state law. They're like, no thank you, we're not going to build, right? And so that's not really a successful communication story. But there have been a few, and I want to highlight one, which is a really famous community, Lexington, Massachusetts, right, sort of the birthplace of the American Revolution, which actually took this law as an opportunity to work with the community to build more housing. And Lexington, which is a town of 33,000, has actually rezoned from this law and is currently has already 1,000 new housing units in the pipeline, right? So that's a pretty massive growth for a very privileged and pretty small suburban community. And what really worked in Lexington was having a unified planning board working closely with a very pro-housing planning department to spend a lot of time talking with the community about this being an opportunity to build housing for children who couldn't currently afford to live in the community, right? Sort of grown children who moved away, who might want to come back, who couldn't. For sort of people who wanted to downsize, right, but couldn't find housing. And so there was sort of a unified public process, or I should say unified public officials working with the public, working with local organizations to really build a pro-housing coalition. And so I just flag that as like, it can happen, and it can happen even in very privileged places, Lexington fought housing for a long time. Like, this was not somewhere that you would have ever expected to be sort of a place where you'd see a real pro-housing movement. And I know there's been examples of this in California and other places as well, places that have sort of shifted perspectives.
So Katherine, can this maybe Lexington be the subject of your next book? Perhaps? That sounds like a great case study.
Yeah, we're doing some work in Lexington and some other places. But yeah, I think it is sort of a hopeful case study about actually getting housing built in an inner core suburb.
It'll be a graphic novel.
That's right, and that would probably be the right way to convey it.
I think that question, though, brings up very visceral reactions that people have to densification, right? I invested a huge amount of money in my house, and I need to recoup that cost. I hate traffic. My kids' school is already super overcrowded. The public park is overrun with people, and it's just, living around a lot of people is hard. And you're gonna add more people to my neighborhood, right? The parking is, or I can't park on the street. And so I do think it's important that we as academics and that elected officials and people who are advocates for building more housing take people at face value and try to understand what their concerns are and try to figure out whether there are policy solutions to some of these challenges in addition to building more housing, right? If you just build more housing and you don't increase transit access, you don't widen roads, you don't build more schools, you are going to make everybody's life worse.
This I absolutely agree. This can also become a kind of compound challenge.
Yes.
So I was reading, I'm reviewing this book called Build Baby Build by libertarian economist named Brian Kaplan. And Kaplan says, he addresses this externality, economists call it congestion and externality, negative externality of construction. How do we address this? Well, we address it the same way that we are going to address housing with the market. And so we need to price, the reason that you have scarce parking or that there are parking spaces available is because we give away parking spots for free. And so we need to price parking. Now, there's some maybe more politically palatable ways to do this. Residential parking permits, for example, are a way to maybe give a little subsidy or a little break to the residential homeowners while also requiring them to pay for housing, pay for parking. And that's been a successful alternative in a few places. But yeah, I mean, the infrastructure concerns are real. Concerns about things like, well, how many ADUs should we be building near the urban wilderness interface?
Right. Or water challenges in California, right? I mean, they're.
And and the answer to that might also be, well, we need more limits on those things too. We need to build desal plants. We need to build a lot of other stuff. Now, that takes I think, I don't want to go too far afield. I think a lot of the motivation that's articulated by academics like us and by the YIMBY movement is we build more housing, make things cheaper. There's another kind of argument that could be made, which is, well, California is an amazing place to live. We want more Americans to live in places where you have basically 0 heating or cooling degree days. If we care about the environment, maybe we should be having more people live here. When you allow a lot of people to live in cities, they have all sorts of there are all sorts of benefits that come with that. So-called network externalities, where Jessica was talking about her move to Nashville, and her kids are enjoying all sorts of of amenities and opportunities that exist when you put people in cities. Now, that's a very different kind of argument. It's kind of argument, it's an argument that's made by the most prominent economist in the space, Ed Glazer, that it's not just about the affordability. Like if you build a lot more housing and a lot more people move to a place, and so the housing price stays approximately the same, you still made a lot of people's life better in doing that. Which I think is an argument that kind of gets lost in just this talking about the price of housing.
I think you can also, to this really important point about having infrastructure actually be built to sort of catch up with housing is have state policies sort of align with housing goals. So one example that comes up a lot is schools, right? That people really worry that, understandably, if you already have overcrowded schools and you build more housing, you are just going to make this policy problem worse. A lot of school funding formulas at the state level, they take your current school enrollments, right, as a way of deciding sort of how much money to give to a particular school system. And that, of course, is going to create really problematic lags if you have a lot of housing growth in a community. And so I think there are ways that state governments that are genuinely excited about building more housing might attach sort of other funding streams like school funding, like transportation funding, to reward communities that build more housing.
We have a lot of questions, so many awesome questions.
YouTube.
I'm just, it's awesome. So many great questions. I think, okay, so I'm gonna just take this one. So the question is, how often does community opposition actually stop housing from being built versus how often is community support taken into account? If all else is equal, which group has greater impact typically?
I want to answer that one too.
Let's start, Alex.
No. The experts first.
So I don't know that we have good data about sort of if we had a public meeting where there's an equivalent number of supporters and opponents, like which one is the public official going to take more seriously. But I think as a general rule of thumb, they're going to perhaps overweight who the loudest voices in the room are, right? And so this is one story about why sort of the way that we've structured the housing development process, which so favors opponents showing up to hearings, has been a system that favors delay or the outright obstruction of housing. So I think understandably, I've actually served on a planning board that approves housing development, so I sort of get like very intuitively where this comes from. You're going to be susceptible to the people who have shown up to a room to yell at you for 3 hours straight. And even if it doesn't make you sort of outright block housing, it might make sort of folks in the room feel more tempted to look for like compromise solutions and delaying housing development. So I think that's sort of the important piece is who shows up.
I mean, and arguably, like, if you support something, you're less likely to be, super motivated to go out and say you support it than if you really oppose it. Because if you really oppose it, you're going to be like, let me go and say something.
Yeah.
Which,
I think it's generally easier in American politics to stop things from happening than to get things to happen. And this is just an example of that, right? So once the system has been set to your advantage, all you have to do is block, right? You don't have to create new things. And so I think that it's just sort of part of the policy process. I will say to Katie's question about data, I collected data on planning decisions in the Bay Area. And I had something like 700 planning decisions that were made over the course of several years. And 98% of the time, the Planning Commission chose to go with what the recommendation was from the planning staff. And so then I interviewed the planning staff and said, why are you doing this? And they said, we're just following the general plan. We're just following the zoning map. And so that tells us that blockers become powerful when their interests are aligned with some structure that got decided 50 years ago in the creation of the general plan and the zoning map that was established in 1963 or whatever it was, right? So that's
Wow, that's powerful. I think Katherine said something that I want to just reemphasize, not just the loudest voices, but the angriest voices. To me, this is some of the psychology we see at Catalyze SV, which is people who are angry tend to strike fear in the heart of bureaucrats and planning commissioners who are like, oh my gosh, no, I don't want to get that person angry. I remember working with the City of San Jose planning department staff around and say, oh, we're not gonna upzone this parcel because a couple people were pretty angry about it. And I wanted to say to them, what the hell do you care? Your job is to plan the best city. Your job is not to care about the average community member. That's the job of the elected official. And each plays a separate role in this society. Why would that be such an issue? And so I just think that that anger is so powerful for us as human beings because it stokes fear in us. Oh my gosh, am I gonna lose my job? Is my boss gonna get mad at me? Is this person gonna show up at my door or stalk me in front of my office place? I mean, that's not a fear you're having maybe consciously, but I think subconsciously it seeps in and you say, oh gosh, I better respond to this person, as opposed to what we see, which is a very not vocal, powerful majority that actually does want more housing, but just doesn't show up. And part of what we also see as to why they don't show up is many of the advocates at Catalyze SV who are passionate about housing want to find housing in this area, but guess what? They stop being advocates of Catalyze SV because they get displaced by the very housing crisis they're trying to solve. And if housing advocates are quote unquote going up against homeowners, that's not a fair fight, because one inherently has the privileges of being in this community and the other is struggling to find their way and their place here.
It's interesting too, like as I watch, board of supervisors meetings or city council meetings, I think when I first started, I would see more opponents, but I think because the housing crisis is so dire, now people who support the housing are realizing that they have to go and speak up. And so you now see more community support, but it's in places that are acutely dealing with this issue because they feel like they really need to. It's really interesting to watch.
I mean, I also think organizations matter, right? We're here right now with an organization that mobilizes in support of housing. And I know there are many folks in the room who are part of that kind of work. I think the density of those organizations is important, and it varies a lot nationally. There are some places, big cities, that have significant housing crises where we don't see those kinds of organizations really mobilizing to turn people up. And without that, you're really not going to get sort of large numbers of supporters to show up to these meetings in the absence of sort of someone else recruiting them, telling them their voice matters, telling them when the meeting is going to happen, all those things.
It took a long time for California to build this network of housing supporters. And the housing problem is way older than the network.
Yeah, the late 80s is my understanding is when the supply started to really drop off in California. Is that right?
Depends on what city or what area you're talking about. But yes. So San Francisco didn't rezone to be mostly single family until the 90s.
Well, we had a question about local legislators versus state legislators. I think we kind of already touched on that, which is the point that local legislators are inculcated, in a sense, from larger concerns and issues of the state. So maybe, Adhiti, we want to get into the historical preservation question?
Oh man, okay.
I know you like that
This
one.
is a fascinating topic. So basically, just to give an overview, and my apologies if I'm telling you things you already know. The questions already show that there's an immense amount of knowledge in this room. It's great. So basically, like as I've been reporting on the housing crisis, I've been noticing this trend that started, in my understanding, a couple years ago, but I bet it probably happened a lot even before, which is that in the advent of streamlining measures that have been passed at the state level, local community groups will notice that, man, there's like less red tape in the way of developments coming in and changing my neighborhood. And I love my neighborhood. I love the historic nature of it and how it looks and the character. So what they've done, what some community groups have done, is they've said that, my neighborhood is a historic neighborhood and it should be preserved as such. And the idea is that, when cities don't protect the character that makes them special, they become kind of these like boxless, lack of personality places. So that's the argument in favor of historic preservation. The problem is that when you designate something as a historic landmark, when you preserve it that way, it becomes really hard to build housing or to build anything because it has to have, the awnings have to be a particular style and it has to be built with this kind of material. So it makes it really difficult. And it's a way that, housing can sometimes be stopped. And even more so, it's often affluent communities that will use historic preservation as a way to stop development. Historic Black neighborhoods are not necessarily protected the same way historic white neighborhoods are. St. Francis Wood is like a great example in San Francisco. It's this like beautiful neighborhood. It looks gorgeous. I mean, I love driving through it, but it is historically preserved. You can't build anything there. I'm curious to talk to y'all about like what is this, and also how do we think about this? Because to some extent, I can understand where people are coming from and wanting to protect the character that makes their cities so unique.
As a Santa Barbarian on the panel, this is something that I've experienced. I've been on the receiving end of these kinds of historic preservation laws. There's a strong rational basis. If we think that city councils should act in the interest of the city, think about city interest, and the way some political scientists talk about the city interest is we're not necessarily concerned about, say, satisfying the median voter, but adopting policies that are going to improve the overall reputation, attractiveness of a city. In a place like Santa Barbara, which maybe it makes a lot of money from tourism, there's a rational argument for having this sort of historic preservation. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is a little bit like saying we want to preserve 1920s Spanish Revival Disneyland, and that's a policy decision. That actually, people go to Santa Barbara and it doesn't look like Orange County does, right? And people go there are more likely to be attracted to go there for vacation. But the problem is what is the trade-off from that? And it's not so much that there's just historic preservation happening, but it's implemented in a way that prevents the building of anything new. It's not just about preservation, but slows down the construction of anything new.
Yeah, I mentioned before that this is the primary way that Nashville prevents development from encroaching on single-family neighborhoods is to use these historic preservation laws. So, I think generally speaking, historic preservation laws are just in the set of regulatory structures that stick in place what's already there. Mm-hmm. And we as a society, when we're making policy, have to decide whether or not we want to accept that trade-off, sticking in place what's already there versus accommodating the change that's happening in our community. So I, unlike Clayton, do not have, I do not understand these laws. So in Nashville, there are huge neighborhoods that were built in the 1980s that are governed by historic preservation. I mean, to my kids, that is really a long, long time ago.
It's 1900s.
So basically, they didn't have TVs or something. I don't know. But there's some line. Like, what are we going to call historic? And how are we going to define historic? And how am I going to tell you that what you want to do with your house doesn't meet my standards of history, right? So it's an idea about community control that maybe not everybody wants to buy into, right? So I guess, generally speaking, the outcome is that historic preservation laws do the same kind of thing that all restrictive regulatory structures do, which is prevent development.
I think they fall also into this camp of regulations and sort of broader structures that sound good on paper, right? That don't sort of have obviously exclusionary intent. And there's so many sort of regulations like this, things that govern sort of how close you can build to wetlands, sort of what your minimum lot size is, right? Things that maybe sort of sound just technocratic, and some of them are sort of more synthetic sounding than others, but we take them as a bundle and they end up having this sort of very exclusionary and restrictive effects. And so I think we have to, as a society, think seriously about the trade-offs in having these policies. Sort of how much is it worth it to us to preserve a community in amber if it means that our children can't live there.
Yeah, one housing advocate I was talking to was like, you know, we can preserve it, but preserve it for who? Like, who gets to enjoy it if nobody can afford to live there?
Yeah.
But
And just a follow-up point on that, I remember looking at some research nationally that says there's something like 200 million empty bedrooms in the United States just sitting there. So if you're preserving that neighborhood and you're preserving for, my parents are baby boomers, if you're preserving for baby boomers who have 3 empty bedrooms in their home because their kids can't afford to live in the community anymore, that house maybe have a higher and better use for a young family with young kids.
If I could just add one more thing, I agree with you, Jessica, that these are pretexts for just achieving a lot of the same things that zoning achieves. I would say that one reason we have all these laws is that the Supreme Court has decided in 1926 that zoning and other local regulations are legitimate exercise of the police power of local governments versus actually being regulatory takings that should require compensation from the government. And so in an ideal world where these property rights are actually respected, we would, if you cared about historic preservation, you could pay your neighbors, or like the city could pay a neighborhood to preserve their houses. But that isn't one reason we get all these new rules is that nobody has to pay the price, except the people who don't get housing.
That's really
Yeah.
Question
Yeah.
here. So so we're talking about, people like baby boomers who maybe bought their home, and when it was affordable to buy a home then. And there's a question in here about Prop 13. And what is Prop 13? And I think it's such an interesting topic because it's like a double whammy because in the way that I understand it, Prop 13 froze property values, or froze the property tax rate. So at this point, if you're a homeowner, if you're trying to sell your home and move into a smaller condo that is maybe more appropriate for the size, it's, first off, like, where are the condos? Like, we're not really building a lot of condos. And so it's not really in your best interest to move out because what is there to move into? And on the other end, if you're like trying to buy a home, it's very expensive to buy a home. You're kind of like shooting for the moon here. And it just seems like this, I don't know what to call it, like this like thing that we can't get out of.
So is the question about sort of what effect Prop 13 had
Yeah,
on
I think it's
the-
like, what is Prop 13 and what effects does it have on the crisis?
You must teach this. Yeah.
I do. It's remarkable how I teach intro to American politics and I teach intro to urban politics, political power in American cities, and every year I say, how many of you know what Prop 13 is? And this is probably a law that has probably a bigger impact on their experience as humans and students in California, primary and secondary education, than any other law on the books, because it's affected school funding so severely, and very few of them know what it is. And then when I explain it, they're aghast at this policy that that leads to such massive inequalities in the tax structure, in effective tax rates, because taxes don't adjust to reflect the increased price value of properties. Now, how does this affect the housing supply? Yeah, it affects the housing supply. It leads people to locks people into their homes. They legitimately say they don't want to move out. How do we make up for the lost revenue from property tax? Instead of smoothing this out over the life of the house, we have a very high progressive income tax in California. So if you're a working professional who makes in the low 6 figures in California and you decide to sell your house, you might be charged at the 13% marginal rate for the capital gains on that house. And so this is, this results in people just being locked into place. In a lot of ways, it's a lot like what rent control does to residential mobility. Once people have a really, really good deal, the longer they stay in a place, having cost-controlled access to property, the longer they, the more they seek to defend it and get entrenched in that location. Of course, but rent control and Prop 13 have this thing in common where people end up making a lot of really bad life decisions, or they pass up opportunities for things like new jobs somewhere else in the city or in a different city because they have such a good deal of housing that they don't want to pass up.
Do you think, I mean, as a follow-up to that question, it's something that keeps me up at night. How do we get out of it? Like, do you see a way that we could recover? Like, as far as I understand it, like cities, the municipal systems are really in trouble because of Prop 13 because they can't get enough property tax revenue to supply the infrastructure and everything that's needed to power a city. Like, what is the way out?
Well, I mean, I think I'd add that the state suffers as well because we have extremely volatile revenue in the state because we rely very heavily on progressive income taxes rather than relying upon property taxes, which are very stable source of revenue. And predictable. Exactly what you would want from good, responsible fiscal policy. What can be done about this? We already tried to repeal, or
It's very popular.
Prop 13. It's extremely popular. And not only that, in Texas, where they've seen housing prices go up, they're having their Prop 13 moment as well, where they've been looking at, there's been talk about adopting a Prop 13-like law in Texas, which would likely to have similar effects. I don't know the current status of that, but it's when you have a lot of price inflation and property taxes go up, like we had in the 1970s.
Right.
That's when
In
you get
Texas,
these.
do they include commercial property in theirs?
I don't know that detail.
Because that was a big
Well, right. So and we've tried to, there's an attempt to repeal the commercial property Prop 13 coverage under Prop 15 was in 2016, and which and the scare campaign, slippery slope scare campaign killed that. Yeah.
We've got time for a few more questions. Let's do a quick lightning round one in case attention spans are flagging a little bit. If there's one piece of research, either yours or a colleague, that you want to leave folks with today that you think is really compelling about community opposition to housing or housing in general, what would that be?
I mean, I would assign Clayton's paper, so.
Thank you. I just signed Jessica's one. I would say that in addition to our really excellent work, there have been some there's been really excellent work in economics. I think Ed Glazer, a lot of the economists approach it from a slightly different perspective than say like Democratic Party-rooted YIMBY movements do, which is that they just see the benefits of letting markets work within cities to liberate housing production. And talk about all the advantages of this. I mean, Ed Glazer's work, including his popular book, Triumph of the City, I think it's a good example of the kind of thing that I encourage people to read.
Along those lines, there's this question, what are your top 3 pieces of advice for housing advocates, especially when up against opposition?
So I don't have 3, but I have one, which is the coalition that's going to be supportive of building housing is often different in each community. And it's important to know your community well enough to understand what is going to mobilize people. So in Merced, people are not persuaded by environmental protection, but they are persuaded by environmental protection in parts of the Bay Area. In the northern part of the Bay Area, people are very persuaded by providing housing for workers, for dishwashers and bartenders. That is not persuasive in other parts of the Bay Area. So the coalition, so finding the advocates and finding the arguments that will work in your community, even in your micro neighborhood community, is very important. It's important to be on the ground.
I also don't know if I have 3, but I would say another thing that I've heard a lot from housing advocates across the country is to not allow housing policy and housing debates to become a partisan issue, especially when you're trying to get state level policy reforms passed But in places where it's become highly aligned with the Democratic Party in particular, that's been the kiss of death, that it is almost inevitably involved bipartisan coalitions. And it's, to put an optimistic spin on it, one of the nice things about housing policy is it's actually a place where we are still able to see sort of really robust bipartisan coalitions.
Yeah, I would second the point about bipartisan coalitions. As soon as people attach a policy to the other party, they begin to hate it. And it's actually, you think that people would choose their party based on the policies that the parties adopt. It's actually, I mean, I think there's pretty robust evidence in political science now that it goes the other way. And just look at issues like Russia or free trade or any number of other policies that have shifted just because Donald Trump is taking a different position.
This question is, we're going to try to do it lightning round style. What will be the impact of CEQA reform?
This is excellent. I mean, I don't have to say anything other than it remains to be seen.
God, I wouldn't hazard a guess right now.
Yeah.
And yeah, the CEQA bar is found to be very creative in how it's going to address whatever reform there is out there.
Like along those lines, like I've heard this housing advocate was telling me that, like, you know, the way that CEQA has been used is often determined at the like judicial level. Like it depends on what lawsuits are kind of being launched, and it depends on how the judge feels about it at the time. And while it seems like now we're heading into a place where judges are starting to rule more in the favor of like limiting CEQA's rules, we don't know, maybe that will, we don't always know if that will be the case, you know, it might change. Okay, maybe one more, is that?
Yeah, one more from the audience. Angela, hopefully we got to your question about Clayton's paper. He talked about folk economics a little bit, so hopefully we covered a little bit of that earlier. Adhiti, I thought the question about hypocrisy was pretty interesting.
Okay.
You want to ask that one?
Actually, yeah, you go for it.
Okay, so the question to the panel, maybe lightning round, maybe not, is are Californians, maybe perhaps particularly progressives, but are Californians hypocritical about housing?
I've written a lot about that.
Well, I think, you know, hypocrisy is made out to be the worst sin in politics. I think it's a pretty common sin and not a moral one. That said, I think there are probably one of the biggest obstacles to California, I'd say, being a beacon of progressive hope in the nation is the fact that if we are lamenting the terrible things that are happening to people in other states, and we don't really make it possible for a lot of them to move here. So if we're concerned about things like abortion rights or reproductive rights, what are the measures that we could adopt that would actually protect people who need protection in that area? And one thing is we could make it easier for them to move here because people are voting with their feet and with their pocketbooks. You're seeing Californians move to Texas, to Georgia, Florida. They're moving to all these places that don't have progressive policies. And they're not doing it because they love the progressive policies in these places. They're doing it because they can afford a house. And that's, and if we don't reconcile that, I think it's, there are lots of ways that the idea that I am here and politics should be built around what is mine and here is pretty analogous to what happens at the national level with respect to immigration. It's just manifested differently in local politics.
Pulling the ladder up after you.
Yeah, pull that up.
Now, I'm not this is an original Alex idea, but I remember when someone said a lot of California progressives don't want to build a wall around their state or their country, but they do want to build a wall around their neighborhoods.
Yeah, this is my friend Mike Greenfield from the Palo Alto City Council campaign in 2016. I was volunteer on this Palo Alto City Council race in 2016 where we elected a mostly YIMBY-ish slate. And the campaign was kind of kicked off with his op-ed, a wall around the US and a moat around my town. Yeah.
Okay, one more question from the audience. Do you observe differences in opposition to new housing in places that rely predominantly on private market development versus places where the state takes a more active role in production, like Singapore or Vienna? Like, yeah, I think it's like, okay, yeah, I read that.
I know nothing about housing politics in other places, so sorry.
I mean, like immediately when I think about that question, I'm reminded of this thing that is in the Abundance book, which is like really gaining traction in the housing movement. I'm sure y'all have read it, which is that, you know, like in the United States where we have a democracy, like there is more community input and there's more opportunities for community to get together and kind of have an opinion about something that's happening in their neighborhood. Whereas in other countries, even though they may be democracies, there aren't always opportunities, at least not the way they exist here in this country, to, you know, say how you feel about something. So then the state plays a bigger role in kind of like determining, you know, we want to build this here, and so bad, too bad if you don't like it, we're just going to do it. But then they're able to build housing. So it's like kind of, you know, it's pros and cons.
Democracy is tricky.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're gonna end with a couple questions back to back. The first one is, what policy solutions do you think will be most impactful for addressing opposition and the housing that it has often stopped? And what makes you hopeful? Who needs to come together to resolve some of these issues that we've been talking about?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so just to start with California, you know, the fact that we've had success with state preemption is reason for optimism. I think the jury is still out on all the reforms that have been adopted so far. That, you know, local governments are extremely adaptive. There's really just kind of an arms race between these state preemption laws and local governments' strategic response or tactical responses to these laws. They come up with new schemes like, you know, impact fees and a whole range of other ways to try to skirt the state law. But the state preemption seems to be working. The other reason I'm optimistic is that, you know, in our public opinion research, even though public opinion might not be pivotal in this space, particularly in the state legislature, people don't have very well-formed opinions about housing markets. It's not so much that they're totally anti-market. It's that they just haven't linked their market beliefs in other domains to their understandings of housing or brought them into their understandings of housing. We actually ran an experiment, and this I think is an answer for Angela's earlier question about folk economics. We used this video from the Sightline Institute, which is a kind of smart growth urbanist environmental think tank in Portland. They compared the housing market to a game of cruel musical chairs, where if you add more chairs, people have a seat. And that analogy alone increased support for building more housing by something like 10 points. Like 0.3 standard deviations, which is a much larger effect than we often see. And that likely is happening because people haven't had very well-formed beliefs about markets, and maybe they just need some education or linking their understandings of other markets to housing. So I think there's reason for optimism there. Yeah.
So my optimistic point is that I just ran a huge survey, nationwide survey, 11,000 respondents. And it's somewhere around 3/4 of the respondents said that they would allow a developer to build an apartment complex in their neighborhood. So, I mean, you could think of all sorts of reasons why that's not true, but they said so on my survey.
You know, I think a lot of the work that folks on this panel and lots of other great research has shown is that local governments are incredibly good at finding creative ways to exclude. And that sometimes it feels like state governments are playing a game of whack-a-mole when they're trying to get local governments to sort of comply with these policies. But I do think when we look at states like California and a lot of other states nationally, the direction that we're moving is a positive one that we are getting. We're never going to fully stop this problem of local government exclusion, but I think we are removing the number of tools they have available to stop housing from getting built. And I think the place where I'm feeling the most optimism is in seeing the growing density of a housing movement in a wide variety of communities. communities across the country. It's not everywhere, but it's really exciting to see that, you know, the housing movement isn't always going to get its way, but it's now become in many places an important interest group to be reckoned with in state and local politics. And I think that's an important sign of progress too.
Well, I think Adhiti and I would keep you all here for another hour and a half asking questions, but some of you might smack me if we asked you to do that. So I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's question. You are welcome to chat with the panelists. Everyone is welcome to hang out. Everyone is welcome to hang out and talk with the panelists for as long as they will allow us before they decide that they have to get back to their important lives. So thank you all so much for being here. This was such a fun conversation.